So our video essay is over Vietnam and Algeria. We're mostly going to be focusing on the origins and causes of their independence movements, but we'll also add some on the methods.
For funsies. Okay, so our first thesis is, although the causes of both the Algerian and Vietnamese independence movements were strikingly similar, a difference lies in how France initially tried to prevent these movements from forming. In Algeria, due to its proximity to France and number of colons there, France emphasized a monoculture, French culture, in order to achieve a sense of loyalty among the Algerians towards the French. However, in Vietnam, France emphasized cultural differences between the people of Vietnam, mainly in the south, in order to prevent a mass movement with a single ideology and goal from forming, because that worked.
So we're going to start by looking at Vietnam, and more specifically, its background and history. So Vietnam was formerly a French colony, and this began in the 19th century. While it was a French colony, we saw that there were heavy taxes, especially on the peasants. And peasants would often have to work really long and hard on French land to pay these off. Then things started to change around World War II, when the Japanese also invaded Vietnam. Basically, France wouldn't give it up, so Ho Chi Minh started stepping in. So here's where we really see the beginnings of the conflict. So to fight off both the Japanese invasion and the French colonial control, Ho Chi Minh created the Viet Minh, which was also known as the League of Independence of Vietnam. Minh was inspired by both Chinese and Soviet communism, which will become more of a problem later. Then in 1945, we see that the Japanese were defeated in the World War II, which basically left the French-educated Bao Dai as emperor. Then the Viet Minh saw this as an opportunity and seized control of the northern city of Hanoi, starting the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and placing Ho Chi Minh as president. Then in 1949, France, who wanted to regain control, set up the state of Vietnam and backed Bao Dai. So we can obviously see that started causing some conflict, but there were really some main key ideologies that really led to the independence movement and the conflict in Vietnam. So first and foremost, independence is key. Both sides wanted independence. Both sides also agreed that they wanted a unified Vietnam, but this is really where the differences started to come in. So the North and Ho Chi Minh wanted more of a communist Vietnam, whereas Bao wanted an economic system that was modeled off the West. So clearly, they both knew what they wanted, but it was both very different. So in the end, the conflict sprouted from a desire to gain independence and a unified Vietnam, free from colonial rule. But both sides did not agree on what this Vietnam should look like. Therefore, conflict and fighting arose.
Okay, so a little bit of background about Algeria. It should come as no surprise that the Algerian War for Independence was quite bloody, because originally, when France tried to occupy Algeria in the 19th century, there was a very bloody conflict that lasted the majority of that time, almost 70 years, because Muslim Algerians did not want to be occupied by France. So what's interesting is, due to Algeria's proximity to France, a lot of French people known as colons moved there and set up their lives and society there. And so because of this proximity, these colons, these Algerian French people, have a ton of political influence in mainland France. So France will eventually want to hang on to this colony, very much so, because they have to please these colons that have this political power still living there. What's also interesting with the power of the colons is that they owned most of the land in Algeria. However, they did not pay the majority of the taxes. Instead, it was the peasant Algerians or the average citizen who was having to pay the taxes, not the landowning colons. And so another thing that we brought up in our thesis that's very interesting is that in Algeria, but partly because of its proximity and the amount of colons living there, France tried to emphasize this monoculture, this French culture in Algeria, to try and force the Algerian people to feel sort of loyalty to France and a sort of, they would identify with it, so they wouldn't want to rebel. However, very clearly, when France tried to occupy Algeria, the Muslim and other communities there have a very different culture that they want to hang on to. And so furthermore, with the Algerian War for Independence, initially the FLN, the main independence movement, didn't have widespread support, partly because of Algerians identifying with France. And so the FLN, they were a guerrilla warfare tactic using group. And so they used bombs, they used coerced pledges of alliance in smaller villages, their leaders. And what's interesting is, though they were performing acts of terrorism oftentimes, the international community and many people within France sided with them. And so eventually, because of the backlash, President de Gaulle had to change his opinion and grant Algeria its independence, despite France technically winning the war.
Yeah, so that really goes over some of the key differences and the key kind of motives between starting this independence movement in both countries. So we're going to start by really focusing more on similarities between them. So both started as post-World War II movements. Basically, there was a fight for democracy at home, and that also led to this double standard of Western powers. So in the end, these two nations decided that they wanted independence. Hence, these conflicts arose. We also see that both were originally agriculture-based economies, where peasants didn't really own land, but still had to pay pretty high taxes. So that, again, started causing a lot of unease and a really huge sense of wanting independence. We also see that a lot of these cities were westernized, whereas rural communities still stayed traditional. So again, that just kind of causes more of a desire for independence because they didn't like the current system that they were under.
So some key takeaways about this is, it's interesting that France tried to emphasize this monoculture within the people of Algeria, when in actuality, after Algeria gained its independence, there were some very big ideological differences that the FLN and the other independence movements had not taken into account. So much so that the newly independent government was actually taken over by a military coup in the following years, a very short period of time, due to the Algerians not being able to agree on what their country stood for and what their ideology was. However, in Vietnam, within the war, yes, the South and the North did have those differences between a more Western government and a more communist government. However, after the war, once the North kind of took over, there was that one ideal and that one, group that was able to maintain administrative power, and so they were able to run more smoothly after the war ended. And so our second thesis, kind of going along with France acting differently between Vietnam and Algeria, is, though the origins, like previously stated, are incredibly similar, we also see a difference in how France deals with the independence movements once they form. In Algeria, due to the immense number of colons and their political power, France wages a brutal war against the FLN without much international backing. However, in Vietnam, France is not the main Western power generally associated with Vietnamese independence. It's the U.S. Though the French did still try and fight the resistance in Vietnam in the North, their use of traditional warfare wasn't helpful in that sense, and really it became the U.S.'s job to kind of win this war, and they completely failed. And so it's interesting how, though France fought so hard for Algeria, they don't seem to be doing the same thing in Vietnam.
Yeah, for sure. I think Maddie, this is you again.
Oh, okay. Despite violence in Algeria. So again, like despite the terrorism the FLN was using, the international community backed them mainly because after World War II, there is this movement of trying to give countries their independence after democracy was fought so hard for. It seemed only fair to let everyone revel in what many of them ended up fighting for within their colonized powers' armies. And so also with counterinsurgency that France used, they were using collective punishments against civilians. They were using torture to try and figure out where the guerrilla cells were. And so they also were moving people into these defense villages. And there is a note that basically this is their signature move. If you look at Vietnam and Algeria, they move people, they rip them from their homes and move them to try and gain some control over them. And so eventually they do face so much backlash in trying to deal with the independence movements.
So now we're also going to take a little bit of a look into the backlash in the U.S. just because this was really prominent, especially in Vietnam. So basically, what happened, especially in the case of Vietnam, was the U.S. was kind of on this quest against communism, and this is really what takes them to Vietnam. So there's basically what is known as the domino effect scare, which is where as one country begins to become communist, then it begins to scare more and more countries because they don't want that to happen as well. So they didn't really need to worry because Vietnam usually isn't friendly with China historically, but anyway, it did scare them, and they did go into this conflict to help stop the spread of communism. So kind of something that we see happen with this is the draft of eligible young men. Many of those young men end up dying or injured or come back with PTSD or exposed to Agent Orange. And that really causes a lot of backlash back in the US because they see that so many people that they know are being injured in the war. And it's a war that a lot of them didn't really understand why they were entering in the first place. So also this begins to really intensify as the US begins to lose the war. And we see extreme backlash from civilians. We see all sorts of protests going on in the US. And really it just the conflict that occurs because of Vietnam really just causes a lot of discontent throughout many nations, particularly in the US. So something that we want to come to kind of at the end of this presentation to bring everything together is our overall thesis. So though the causes of both independence movements really are incredibly similar, France's actions when trying to prevent the movements, as well as its successes in dealing with those effects, greatly differs. And that's something that we see throughout our presentation and throughout all of these slides. So that is really the overall conclusion that we wanted to come to. And thank you for watching. Awesome.
Yeah. So